Welcome to the Grueling Truth Sports Network and another episode of On This Day. I'm your host, Mike Goodpastor, and on this day, December the 8th, 1940, we're going to talk about an NFL championship game that many of you probably have heard about just because of the final score, which was a 73-0 win for the Chicago Bears over the Washington Redskins. But a lot of people don't know the entire backstory and everything else that happened that December the 8th, 1940. And today we're going to talk about that a little bit. Now, 3 weeks before that championship game, the Bears and Redskins played. And trailing 7-3 with 90 seconds left in the game, the Chicago Bears started on the 50-yard line on what they hoped would be the game-winning drive. The host Washington Redskins also had hopes a win would keep them in contention for the NFL's Eastern Division title. A sellout crowd of over 35,000 was on its feet all that afternoon, November the 17th, 1940, and looking for an upset victory over the monsters of the Midway. It would be a great win, and considering the Bears had handily outgained the Skins in passing, rushing, and kick returning, it would be a big surprise. So after an incomplete pass, Bears quarterback Sid Luckman connected with halfback George McAfee, who streaked down toward the goal line. Washington defensive back Dick Todd stopped him on the half-yard line, and the home crowd roared its approval. With seconds ticking off the clock high in the bleachers, the Bears drew a 5-yard penalty. On the next play, two Washington defensive linemen swatted away Luckman's first pass attempt, leaving the Bears with only seconds to run another play. With the Bears in their, at the time, revolutionary T formation, Luckman took the snap from under center, dropped back and fired the ball at fullback Bill Osmowski. Jostled by Redskin defenders in the end zone, Osmowski got his hands on the ball but couldn't bring it down. With no time left on the clock, Bears coach, the legendary George Halas, joined his team on the field, yelling for an interference call from the referees. No luck and no instant replay in those days. Game over. Now, George Preston Marshall was the Redskins owner. He was a press-savvy promoter and businessman, to say the least. But in the post-game excitement, he derided the calls for a penalty on the final play and declared to the reporters, the Bears are a bunch of crybabies. The Bears are nothing more than quitters. Now, 3 weeks later, on a day, over 80 years ago, Marshall would have to eat those words. In 1932, the NFL owners added a franchise. It was in Boston. Of course, the New England Patriots are there now, but under the ownership of George Preston Marshall, who was an entrepreneur from Washington, D.C., he named a team in Boston after the Major League Baseball team in town, the Braves. A common practice in the early NFL. There was the Cincinnati Reds NFL team in 1934. The New York Giants, for example, were named after the baseball team, as were the Pittsburgh Pirates before they became the Steelers. The new Boston team played at Braves Field, a baseball park, in 1932, and moved to Fenway Park for the 1933 season. As a tribute to the host Red Sox, Marshall changed the team name to Redskins. Before the season's home opener against New York, the players actually posed for photographs in war paint and feathers. They left the makeup on for the game, and although things were a bit messy under those leather helmets, the Redskins beat the Giants 21-20. Could you imagine a team doing that today and making fun of the American Indians like that? I don't think that would happen today. And George Preston Marshall had a history of racism. He is also, if you listen on this day a few days back, one of the reasons why African American players played in the NFL up until about the time he took over the Redskins. Well, the Braves at that point. And he basically turned everybody against it, and he basically segregated it, got rid of the African American athletes. Unfortunately, he's still in the Hall of Fame, which, if you've listened to me before, I think is an absolute crime. Professional football didn't play well for Preston in Boston, though. And Marshall lost a ton of money. And it was, as his wife said, the Boston sports writers were loud in their dislike of pro football. Corinne Griffith was his wife. She wrote that in 1947. She said, it was too far a cry from Harvard for Mr. Marshall. Marshall, who owned a chain of laundries in Washington, moved the team to the District of Columbia prior to the 1937 season. Griffith His wife had been a silent film star. She married Marshall in 1936 and actively promoted the team. She wrote the lyrics to the team fight song, Hail to the Redskins, and chose the team colors of burgundy and gold. Now let's fast forward to 1940. After the Redskins upset the Bears and the crybaby taunts that followed from Marshall, Washington won the NFL's Eastern Division. Chicago won the West, and the two teams would collide in the NFL Championship on December the 8th, 1940 in Griffith Stadium, the Washington Senators' home ballpark. Now, the Bears arrived in Washington by train the morning before the game and held a brief workout at Griffith Stadium after the Redskins had finished their practice. They then settled into the Mayflower Hotel, a local landmark in D.C., 5 blocks from the White House. There they saw that the hometown press had continued the Marshall cry of calling them crybabies. One of the players, Bears halfback Bob Snyder, said, "We got to our hotel rooms, and the sports section was on top of everybody's bed. And the headline was, 'Gutless Bears hit the nation's capital.'" The bookies, though, had the Bears as a 7-5 favorite, but the locals had snapped up over 36,000 seats for the game. Washington Post reporter Al Haley described the ticket demand. He said, "It'll be easier tomorrow to get into the White House than it will be to get into Griffith Stadium if you don't have a ticket." Haley also wrote about the contrasting styles of the two teams, especially their offensive formations. The Bears were a more modern at the time T formation, with the quarterback under center and the fullback and halfbacks lined up abreast behind him. Now, Luckman is still considered to be the first modern-day quarterback. He was the first great T-formation quarterback, and he is now in the Professional Football Hall of Fame. On the other side, Washington still used the old single-wing formation that had been popular for a couple decades, with the tailback taking a long snap, much like today's shotgun. The quarterback was mostly a blocking back. Slinging Sammy Ball, who is another Hall of Famer, was the Redskins' tailback in 1940. He did most of the passing from the tailback position in the single-wing offense. Now, before the 1:30 p.m. start, Coach Hallis played his strongest motivational card yet. He had posted newspaper clippings on the locker room wall, all reporting Marshall's inflammatory comments from the Bears-Redskins game the previous month. Luckman told a Milwaukee reporter in 1980 what Hallis did next. "Before we took the field, Hallis pointed to the clippings and said, 'Gentlemen, this is what Mr. Marshall thinks of you. I know you are the greatest football team in America. I know it, and you know it. I want you to prove that to Mr. Marshall, the Redskins, and above all, the entire nation.' After that," Luckman continued, "we let out a big war whoop, broke down the door, trying to get onto the field. On the first play from scrimmage, Bears halfback George McAfee ran for 7 yards. Hallis jumped from the bench and yelled, 'We got him!' Hallis said years later that if the Redskins lined up in the 5-3-3 defense they had used in the November game, his game plan for the title game would work. 'We ran one play as a test,' Hallis said, according to the LA Times reporter Bob Wolf, to see which defense they were using. Hallis had the answer, and it was the answer he wanted. On the next play, Bill Osmanski scored on a 68-yard run. Jack Manders kicked the extra point. The Redskins quickly responded when Max Krause returned Manders' kickoff 56 yards to the Bears' 40-yard line. After the Redskins advanced the ball to the Chicago 25, and Charlie Maloney dropped a Sammy Ball pass on the 4-yard line. Bob Masterson then missed a 32-yard field goal attempt, and the Bears took over on their own 20. Chicago then drove 80 yards in 17 plays, with Luckman scoring on a sneak. The extra point made it 14-0. Every Redskins possession in the first quarter yielded nothing, while the Bears scored a third time on a 42-yard run by Joe Manaki. Chicago scored only once in the second quarter on a 30-yard pass from Luckman to end Ken Cavanaugh. During halftime, Hallis gave his players a pep talk. "We can't let up." According to reserve quarterback Solly Sherman in a 1990 interview said that Hallis said, "The Redskins are too good a team. They can come back." Corinne Griffith, of course the wife of the Washington owner, recalled that the Washington fans were stunned during the intermission. What happened, she heard people ask. What's the matter? In her book, My Life with the Redskins, Mrs. Griffith offered her take. The Redskins became mentally petrified. Player injuries were surely a factor for the Redskins that day. They started the game with only 32 players because of injuries sustained in the final 2 regular season games. 4 played hurt, and 3 were banged up enough during the game to put them on the bench. In the third quarter, the Bears intercepted 3 passes, 1 from Ball and 2 by Roy Zimmerman, and ran each back for touchdowns. Ray Nolting also ran 23 yards for the 4th Bears score in the quarter. Midway through the third quarter onslaught, the Redskins PA announcer urged the fans to buy season tickets for 1941. The crowd booed mightily, venting some of their frustrations. The Redskins had another big problem in the fourth quarter. They were running out of footballs. And at the time, no stadium had nets behind the goalpost. So the extra point and field goal attempts sailed into the stands. The rabid Washington fans, who were pissed off enough by this point anyways, would not give up the footballs. Now, John Carroll said in an interview, "My dad sent people into the stands to buy back the balls." And Carroll's dad was a real estate developer in Virginia, and his father, Sid, was the Redskins business manager in 1940. We were offering $30 to $40 a ball for each, but we got no takers. After touchdown number 10, which put the Bears up 66-0, Sherman came on the field to hold for the point after kick. "What are you doing?" asked referee Red Frizzell. "We're kicking," said Sherman, who later told this story to a reporter. "Oh, no, you're not. You're passing. That's the last ball we've got." Now, after a Bears huddle, Maniaci passed to Sherman for the conversion. Carroll said that his father walked over to the Chicago bench to ask Callis to run or throw for any more extra points. At that point, Marshall got up from his seat and said to his wife, "I'm going down to those kids. Anything might happen." Walking down the stairs with a police escort, Marshall got an earful from a spectator. "Get him out of here, you lug. Take him back to Boston." Chicago scored again in the final 2 minutes, making the final score 73-0, a single game margin that remains an NFL record to this day. Washington rushed for a total of 5 yards. They threw 8 interceptions and produced a whopping 231 yards. Chicago, 519 yards. But I think the big story of this game is the 8 interceptions. Now, one of the Bears shouted as they got to the locker room, "Who are the crybabies now?" Hallis talked with more grace when interviewed by the press, and his quote was, "It was just one of those days. Everything we did right. Everything they did wrong." Marshall was outraged at first, but calmed down, according to Redskins historian Mike Richmond. "They didn't lack courage," Marshall said to the press, "but they lost their heads." Now, an epilogue for this would be an interview I found while doing the research for this show. And in that interview, Sammy Ball, who, for lack of a better term, can be full of crap from time to time, cast a shadow on the 1940 NFL championship game in a 1999 interview he did, when he said that many of his teammates tried to lose the game to spite Marshall. Ball said, "I think it happened because of what the owner did for 2 weeks." And in a follow-up interview with the AP, he went even deeper into that. He said, "He put things in the paper running the Bears down. You don't want to help the other team. You shouldn't say things like that. It made me so mad." Now, the AP reporter asked Washington lineman Clyde Sugart, who played in the title game, to comment on Ball's statement. Sugart said, "Was he drunk when he said that? I don't remember anything like that. I played as hard as I could, but I never saw so many holes on a line." Now, George Musso, a Hall of Fame lineman who played for the Bears that day, gave his take on Ball's claim to the AP. "It doesn't make sense. We just outplayed them. That was all. We had 7 Hall of Famers on our club. There was good reason for us to win." So there you go, guys. The story of the 73-0 NFL championship game played this day, December the 8th, 1940. Remember, you can hear us every day on this day for a little backstory of something huge or historical that happened on that day in sports history. You can follow us at Grueling Truth on Twitter, And make sure you listen to all of our shows on iHeartRadio, Spotify, Spreaker, Stitcher, wherever you find sports podcasts, you'll find The Grueling Truth. So for Mike Goodpaster, you've been listening to On This Day, on The Grueling Truth, where the legends speak.